because it's never mentioned. The Declaration of Principles specifies the final outcome of negotiations they're leading to in the end. And what it says is the final outcome will be UN 242. Well, anyone who knows about the region knows what UN 242 says. That's the main resolution. It calls for a peace, negotiated settlement, but no mention of Palestinian rights. Nothing. There's a phrase saying Palestinians are refugees, treat them nicely or something, but that's it. So the long-term end of the negotiations was nothing for the Palestinians. That's the Oslo Agreement. Abdel Shafi just refused to attend the celebratory meeting with shaking hands and all that stuff. Meanwhile, the settlements continued without a break. Take a look at that's the crucial issue. Take a look at the record of settlements since Oslo, straight line increases. 2010 actually was the peak of settlement. In 2002, Saudi Arabia produced a plan which is essentially identical with the international consensus. The Arab League endorsed it a couple of years later. Organization of Islamic States endorsed it. That happens to include Iran. Meanwhile, the quartet was established. That's the U.S., Europe, the UN, and Russia. And they called for what was called a roadmap. It was actually initiated by Bush. This is Bush number 2. The roadmap was rejected instantly by Israel. They accepted it, but added 14 reservations. If you read the reservations, they wipe it out. But the reservations were never mentioned. Just the fact that they accepted it. So then you could blame the Palestinians for anything that happened. Hamas, which is a political parties don't recognize states. Like, the Democratic Party doesn't recognize France. But Hamas, which is a political party, is regularly condemned for not accepting the roadmap, not recognizing Israel. In the U.S., at least, I don't know about here, there's hardly a word about the fact that the government of Israel flatly rejected it, immediately rejected it. Actually, the first in the kind of mainstream, aside from distant publications and talks like these, the first mention of it was by Jimmy Carter in his book on the Peace or Apartheid. The book was bitterly attacked, a huge attack on him. One thing that was never mentioned was that he quoted the 14 Israeli reservations, which essentially rejected the code map. Roadmap was never mentioned. Well, meanwhile, in 2006, an important event happened, and the first and only free elections in the Arab world, carefully monitored, recognized to be free and fair in Palestine, but they came out the wrong way. Hamas won, and that's not supposed to happen. So therefore, the United States and Israel, with the EU joining, as always, instantly turned to punishing the population harshly for voting the wrong way in a free election. That actually tells us quite a lot about the proclaimed yearning for democracy that you read about constantly from leading intellectuals, and government officials, and so on. There was a clear test. Here's a free election. Nobody questioned that. Came out the wrong way. Therefore, we punished the people who voted. Obama was extreme in this case. He wasn't president at the time, but in the 2008 election, when he was elected, he proudly reminded voters, I'll quote him, that he was the co-sponsor of the Palestinian Anti-Terrorism Act of 2006, introduced in the wake of Hamas's victory in the Palestinian elections, outlaws direct assistance to any entity of the Palestinian Authority controlled by Hamas, who won the election. The hatred for democracy is very principled and sometimes quite explicit. This is one, and not just for the Middle East, incidentally. It's general. There's pretty good scholarship on this, mainstream conservative scholarship, which points out, shows that the United States supports democracy if and only if it conforms to strategic and economic objectives. You could say the same thing about Stalin. And others are the same. It's hardly surprising. There's a very simple reason. Enormous splits between public policy and public opinion, so therefore you can't possibly back democracy. Same with the Arab Spring. And in fact, the same is true internal to the United States. There's a very serious shredding of functioning democracy. Anybody who's watched the electoral extravaganzas can see it. And again, a simple reason. Public opinion is very sharply opposed to bipartisan public policy, so therefore you just can't have anything like a democratic election. Somehow the population has to be marginalized and excluded by, extravaganzas, gossip, usual techniques. There's good political science research on this, incidentally, right in the mainstream. Recent book came out by Matthew Gillens, well-known political scientist, who goes through polls and policy decisions in extensive detail. And what he shows is that about 75% of the population can have no influence on policy at all. And meanwhile, the rich get what they want, no matter what public opinion is. Now, the poll result, the polling data, doesn't allow him to look at the top 1% or the top fraction of 1%, which is where the main concentration of wealth is in the last 30 years. If he was able to do that, he found that they're the people who get what they want. Doesn't matter what the 99.9% might want. So therefore, you have to have these electoral extravaganzas, marginal issues, and so on, because democracy is just too dangerous. All of this is cloaked in thick layers of hypocrisy and deceit. It's a major commitment of the intellectual classes to conceal all of this. You don't have to give you examples. Well, let's go back to the 2006 elections in Palestine. The U.S. and Israel, jointly with the Palestinian Authority, immediately began to organize a military coup to overturn the electoral results. That's, again, normal. The coup was planned for summer 2007. It was preempted by Hamas. And Hamas has since been bitterly condemned for taking over the Gaza Strip in a preemptive strike to block the U.S., Israeli, and Palestinian Authority military coup that was planned. And the savagery of the siege escalated sharply at that time. In July 2008, there was a ceasefire reached between Israel and Hamas. Israel didn't pay any attention to it. Part of the ceasefire was they were supposed to end the siege. It's, of course, an act of war, but they disregarded that. However, Hamas observed it. There was not a single, you look at official Israeli records, there wasn't a single Hamas rocket detected during the period of the ceasefire. In November 2008, Israel invaded the Gaza Strip, killed half a dozen Hamas activists, and that started rocket fire up and back. All the casualties, of course, are Palestinian, as usual. In December, Hamas offered to reinstate the ceasefire, but Israel refused and instead invaded. That's Operation Cast Lead, this utter horror story. The shocking war crimes, the UN did try to call a ceasefire, but the U.S. blocked it. Usual business. Obama's record was interesting. He had already been elected president, but he hadn't taken office yet. So his line is, well, if he couldn't say anything about it, he said, there's only one president, I'm not president yet, so I can't say anything about it. The attack on Gaza was very carefully programmed. Of course, Israel can do anything it wants. There's no defense. And it was planned to end, and it did end, immediately before Obama's inauguration. That meant he never had to say anything about it. his reaction was, when he was inaugurated, he said, well, we should forget about the past, we should look forward. That's very progressive. That's a great position for murderers and aggressors, quite standard international affairs. Well, I won't go through the record since. It's still worse. The veto last February 2011, essentially ended discussion about the settlements. And right now, it's just totally brazen. Nothing's even concealed. So, for example, when UNESCO admitted the Palestinian Authority, the U.S., of course, instantly defunded UNESCO. It's not the first time. It happened under Reagan, too. And Israel responded to the acceptance by announcing a new settlement, Givat HaMatos, right between Bethlehem and Jerusalem, to close off the last corridor between Bethlehem and Jerusalem. In fact, they do whatever they like, while Obama just genuflects. He's quite unlike preceding American presidents. Every preceding American president took some steps to deter Israel, to even punish them slightly. The case of Bush #2, he went pretty far. Israel wanted to sell arms to China, so its economy is based on military exports. It's a huge market. Clinton wouldn't let them do it, so they backed down. They tried to do it under Bush. Bush not only compelled them to back down, but went out of his way to humiliate them. He would not permit high Israeli officials to his administration. I don't know if he knew what was happening. They wouldn't allow high Israeli military officials to visit the United States. They insisted on an official apology and, of course, withdrawal of the program. Obama is the first president to accept everything politely, even accept direct humiliations. That's a change. Well, right now there's the standard Western line, U.S. line, is a call for negotiations, just a couple of days ago again. And there's supposed to be a barrier, namely the Palestinians insist on preconditions. That's the standard discourse. The reality is that preconditions are a problem, but it's the U.S. and Israel that insist on the preconditions. Two crucial preconditions. One of them is that the negotiations take place under the auspices of the United States. I mean, that's about like saying that Iran ought to negotiate conflicts in Iraq between Shiites and Sunni. I mean, if there were real negotiations, they would be between the world on one side and Israel and the United States on the other, and they'd be run by some country that has a degree of respect in international affairs, maybe Brazil or somebody like that. But of course, nobody can see this, it's too obvious. That's one precondition. The U.S. has to run it, which guarantees that nothing can happen. And the other precondition is that the settlements have to continue. So two major preconditions which make it impossible for negotiations to proceed. Well, let's take a look at what the options are right now. I mean, one option is the overwhelming international consensus on a two-state settlement. Incidentally, that includes the majority of the American population, too, but they have almost no effect on policy. There's a second alternative, which is widely discussed. It's called giving the keys to Israel. So let's just let Israel take over the whole of mandatory Palestine. There'll be one state, and then there can be a civil rights struggle and an apartheid struggle like South Africa. That's a total illusion. It overlooks a very crucial fact. There's a third alternative. The third alternative is what the United States and Israel are in fact doing, and they'll just continue doing it. What they're doing is very straight. Gaza will be retained as a prison, kept on a diet, as among the high Israeli officials. Though Weissglass pointed out, we don't want everyone to die, it won't look good. We'll keep them on a diet so they can kind of barely survive and living in this prison. That's Gaza. The Golan Heights, they just take. The West Bank, take what's valuable. That means everything to the west of the so-called separation wall, which is Arab land, water resources, the nice suburbs of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, Jordan Valley, where the Palestinians are being kicked out systematically and Israel's settling it, drilling wells and so on, corridors cutting through, which leave unviable cantons.